The Sunday morning, our church newsletter proudly announced that my late wife's handmade quilt had raised nearly $12,000 during the annual charity auction. I felt something I had not experienced since Eleanor passed away. Pride. 30 minutes later, I climbed into our attic to look at the quilt one more time. It was still folded inside the cedar chest, or so I believed. The moment my hands touched the fabric, I knew someone had quietly replaced it. The colors matched, the pattern matched. Even the tiny stitched bluebirds looked almost perfect. Almost. Eleanor always hid one golden thread beneath the final border of every family quilt. This one didn't have it. Someone had taken my wife's real quilt and left behind a beautiful imitation that only I could recognize as false. If you've ever believed love could survive inside the smallest details, stay with me. For several minutes I simply sat beside the cedar chest without moving. The attic smelled exactly as it always had. Cedar wood, old cardboard boxes, lavender sachets. Eleanor insisted on sewing into every storage blanket. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The replacement quilt had been folded with extraordinary care. Whoever exchanged it wanted me to believe nothing had changed. During 28 years managing Air Force property inventories, I learned a lesson that rarely failed. People usually noticed when something disappeared. Far fewer noticed when something quietly took its place. I carried both the church newsletter and the replacement quilt downstairs. The newsletter featured a full-page photograph of smiling volunteers standing beside an auction display. Across the center hung what everyone believed was Eleanor's final masterpiece. The caption read, "The Hayes Legacy Quilt raises $12,000 for military widow outreach." Legacy Quilt. The church had even used Eleanor's own name for it. I looked again at the quilt spread across my dining room table. The border stitching differed by less than half an inch. The corner roses contained 12 petals instead of 11. Tiny differences. Meaningful ones. No volunteer would ever notice. Only the man who watched Eleanor sew every evening for almost 47 years. My granddaughter, Emily, stopped by just before lunch carrying homemade soup. She noticed the quilt immediately. "I thought Grandma's quilt was at the auction." "So did I." She looked from the newspaper to the table, then quietly frowned. "They look identical." "They're not." I showed her the missing golden thread, then the altered flower pattern. Emily gently traced the stitching with one finger. "I've never seen this one before." Neither had I. That mattered more than anything else. If Eleanor had made 2 quilts, I would have remembered. She always shared every design with me long before the first stitch. Before leaving, Emily quietly asked, "Do you think someone stole it?" I folded the replacement quilt carefully. "No. I think someone wanted me to believe they didn't." That afternoon I drove to the church fellowship hall, intending to ask one simple question. Who had collected Eleanor's quilt for the auction? Instead, I discovered the donation ledger resting open on the welcome table. One entire page had been carefully removed. I stood beside the church welcome table for several long moments, staring at the donation ledger. The missing page had not been torn away carelessly. Someone had removed it with remarkable precision. No jagged edges, no damaged binding, just a clean gap between 2 weeks of donation records. During 28 years managing Air Force property inventories, I investigated more missing equipment reports than I cared to remember. Paper almost never disappeared by accident, especially when every page around it remained untouched. Before I could examine the ledger more closely, Harold Pierce walked across the fellowship hall carrying 2 storage boxes. "Ronald, I heard you came by. I wanted to ask about Eleanor's quilt." He smiled kindly. "I'm afraid we had a small mix-up." "What kind of mix-up?" "A volunteer accidentally collected the wrong quilt." "Technically possible, emotionally incomplete. So the original never went to auction?" "That's what we believe." "Believe, not know." His answer settled quietly in my thoughts. Harold had always been careful with words. After serving as church treasurer for nearly 20 years, he rarely stated anything he couldn't later support with paperwork. "I'd like to see the donation records." "They're being reorganized." Another technically honest answer, emotionally unfinished. Instead of arguing, I simply nodded. I understand. Strategic patience had solved more inventory problems than confrontation ever had. Harold visibly relaxed. He believed the conversation was over. That afternoon, I visited the Quilting Guild workshop Eleanor attended every Wednesday for nearly 15 years. The room still smelled faintly of cotton fabric, cedar cabinets, and the lavender tea the women always shared while sewing. Margaret Lawson looked up from a quilt frame the moment I entered. "Ronald, we've been thinking about you." "I've been thinking about Eleanor." She smiled gently. "So have we." I unfolded the replacement quilt across one of the large cutting tables. Margaret studied it quietly. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of examining the center pattern, she immediately turned the quilt over. She carefully counted stitches along the border, 21, then 22. Finally, she closed her eyes. "This isn't Eleanor's finishing pattern." "You noticed." "Immediately." For the first time since finding the replacement, someone besides me recognized the difference. Margaret quietly lowered her voice. "There were always rumors." "What rumors?" "That Eleanor spent nearly 2 years making 2 quilts." "2 quilts? Not one." The possibility immediately contradicted everything I believed. "If she made another quilt, I never saw it." "Neither did anyone else." Another technically honest answer. Emotionally impossible. Before I left, Margaret unlocked a small cabinet beneath the guild library. Inside rested annual insurance appraisals for quilts displayed during church exhibitions. She handed me Eleanor's file. The appraisal described 1 quilt, estimated value, dimensions, thread count, fabric history. Then one handwritten notation near the bottom caught my attention. "Original retained under private guild agreement." Original. Not only quilt, original. Driving home, I realized the missing donation ledger page no longer represented the biggest mystery. Someone already expected 2 quilts to exist. The real question was why only one had ever been publicly acknowledged. For the next 4 days, I behaved exactly the way Harold Pierce expected. I stopped asking about the missing ledger page. I thanked him for looking into the quilting mix-up. I even told Emily that the church's explanation probably made more sense than my own suspicions. She smiled with visible relief, not because the mystery had disappeared, because she believed I had finally accepted the simplest answer. During 28 years managing Air Force property inventories, I learned another lesson that saved more investigations than any written procedure. The moment people believed you had stopped counting, they stopped protecting the numbers. That became my strategy. On Wednesday morning, I quietly returned to the Quilting Guild workshop before the weekly sewing circle began. Margaret Lawson was already arranging fabric bundles across the long oak tables. "I had a feeling you'd come back." "I've been thinking about the appraisal." "So have I." She led me into the guild library, a narrow room lined with pattern books, competition ribbons, and carefully labeled archive boxes. Unlike the church records, these files belonged entirely to the guild. No donation ledgers, no financial reports, only quilting history. Margaret reached for a faded binder marked Founders Sewing Journals, not Eleanor's journals, the guild's. She opened the binder to a handwritten index. Beside Eleanor's name appeared more entries than any other member. Pattern studies, fabric donations, veterans' remembrance quilts, widow comfort projects. Then one final entry quietly caught my attention. Legacy Pear Project. Pear, not quilt. Pear. Margaret noticed me staring at the words. I always wondered why Eleanor chose that title. You never asked. I did. What did she say? Margaret smiled softly. She said one quilt would someday comfort memories. The other would comfort people. Technically complete, emotionally unfinished. Driving home, I realized the replacement quilt had never been intended as a forgery. It had always been intended as something else. That afternoon, Emily unexpectedly stopped by carrying a small cardboard box she discovered while cleaning her grandmother's sewing room. I almost donated these. Inside rested dozens of fabric swatches carefully pinned to handwritten notes. Most described thread colors and stitching techniques. Nothing unusual, until I reached one cream-colored envelope tucked beneath the final sample. Across the front, Eleanor had written only 4 words. Open after both remain, not after I'm gone, not after the auction, after both remain. Inside, I found 2 tiny pieces of blue fabric. They appeared identical. Then I turned them over. One carried Eleanor's familiar golden finishing thread. The other did not, exactly like the 2 quilts. At the bottom rested one handwritten sentence. If someone mistakes one for the other, they are looking at cloth instead of purpose. For several minutes, neither Emily nor I spoke. Finally she whispered, "Grandma knew this day would come." I think she planned for it. That evening I returned to the attic, carrying both fabric samples. For the first time, I stopped comparing what had been taken. Instead, I began asking why Eleanor wanted 2 nearly identical creations to exist at all. Then I noticed something I had somehow overlooked since the beginning. Hidden beneath the replacement quilt inside the cedar chest lay one of Eleanor's old sewing journals. The bookmark rested halfway through the final chapter. I carried Eleanor's sewing journal downstairs as though it were made of glass. The worn blue cloth cover felt familiar beneath my hands. For years I assumed it contained nothing more than quilt measurements, thread colors, and pattern sketches. I had been wrong before. I wasn't eager to repeat that mistake. The bookmark rested exactly halfway through the final section. Not at the beginning, not at the end, as though Eleanor expected someone to arrive at that page only after learning everything else first. During 28 years managing Air Force property records, I learned another lesson that quietly shaped every investigation. The most important document rarely answered the first question. It changed the question entirely. I opened the journal. The page wasn't filled with stitching instructions. It contained two carefully drawn quilt diagrams, side by side, one labeled Memory Quilt, the other Mercy Quilt. Not original, not duplicate. Memory. Mercy. For several minutes I simply stared at those two words. The quilts had never been competing with one another. They had always been serving different purposes. Beneath the drawings, Eleanor had written a single sentence. One should remind our family where love began. The other should help strangers believe it has not ended. Driving to the Quilting Guild later that morning, I no longer wondered whether two quilts existed. I knew they did. The mystery had become something entirely different. Why had everyone insisted on calling one quilt the original? Margaret Lawson was alone inside the workshop when I arrived. Without speaking, I placed the journal beside her. She quietly read the page, then closed the cover. "I hoped you'd eventually find this." "You knew?" I knew Eleanor divided her last project into two purposes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret sighed gently. "Because she believed the journal had to find you. Technically honest, emotionally unfinished." She unlocked another cabinet I had never noticed before. Unlike the Guild archives, these drawers held personal correspondence donated by former members. Margaret carefully removed one sealed envelope. Across the front, Eleanor had written, "Open only after Ronald discovers there were never two originals." Inside rested a folded Quilting Guild agreement, signed almost 3 years before Eleanor passed away. Every Guild officer had signed, Margaret included. At the bottom, Eleanor added one handwritten condition. "Neither quilt shall be publicly identified until Ronald understands why ownership is the wrong question." Ownership, not value, not inheritance. Ownership. The word stayed with me long after I left the workshop. That afternoon I visited the insurance office that prepared Eleanor's quilt appraisal. The senior appraiser recognized her file immediately. "I remember this project." "You do?" "It was unusual." "Why?" He opened the archived appraisal. 2 photographs appeared, not one. One showed the Memory Quilt, the other the Mercy Quilt. Both carried identical insured values. Neither was described as a copy. Instead, one notation immediately caught my attention. Coverage issued only if both quilts remain legally connected under one charitable agreement. Legally connected, another phrase that changed everything. When I returned home, Emily was waiting on the front porch. She held another small bundle wrapped in Eleanor's favorite blue fabric. "I found this inside Grandma's sewing cabinet." Inside rested dozens of tiny paper labels. Each listed the name of a military widow. Every label ended with the same handwritten phrase, "Wrapped in mercy." For the first time since opening the church newsletter, I understood the real conflict. The missing quilt had never been hidden because it was valuable. It had been protected because someone was still trying to preserve the promise stitched into every one of its threads. And the annual church remembrance service was now only 5 days away. 5 days remained before the church remembrance service. 5 days before Eleanor's quiet promise would either become permanent or disappear beneath another layer of misunderstanding. I carried the bundle of widow name labels home and spread them across the dining room table. Each small paper strip held a first name, sometimes a last name, always the same closing words. Wrapped in mercy, not donated, not remembered, wrapped. The phrase sounded less like bookkeeping and more like a promise. For nearly an hour, I arranged the labels by date. Military habit returned without my thinking about it. Inventory first, pattern second, meaning last. 28 years managing Air Force property had taught me that scattered records often formed a complete story long before anyone recognized it. Emily quietly watched from the opposite side of the table. "You're organizing them." "I'm listening to them." She smiled sadly. "Grandma used to say paper tells the truth if you stop asking it to speak too quickly." That sounded exactly like Eleanor. The next morning, Margaret Lawson called. "I found something you need to see." Within the hour, I was back inside the Quilting Guild archive. Margaret placed an old attendance ledger beside Eleanor's sewing journal. Not church records, guild meeting minutes. Every monthly meeting listed projects, volunteers, donated fabric, and finished quilts. Then one section immediately caught my attention. Mercy Circle. Unlike ordinary guild meetings, attendance names had been replaced by numbers. Participant 1, Participant 2, Participant 3, no identities, only coded entries. At the bottom of every page, Eleanor had written one sentence: "Privacy protects healing." Technically simple, emotionally profound. Margaret quietly explained the widows never wanted charity. They wanted dignity. Another puzzle piece quietly settled into place. The Mercy quilt had never been created to raise money alone. It had become the symbol of a ministry built upon protecting women who had already lost enough. Then Margaret handed me another folder. Insurance renewal correspondence, the same appraisal I had already seen, except this copy included one missing attachment, a rider agreement. The original quilt could never be sold permanently. It could only be displayed, auctioned ceremonially, and immediately transferred into the custody of the Military Widow Legacy Trust. Ownership never changed. Stewardship did. Driving home, I finally understood why Eleanor rejected the word original inside her journal. Neither quilt existed to replace the other. Each protected something different. That afternoon, I stopped by the church archive, hoping Harold Pierce might finally release the missing donation records. Instead, I found the storage room locked. A handwritten notice hung across the door. Archive preparation for remembrance service. Harold emerged moments later, carrying 2 banker boxes filled with files. "You picked a busy week." "I wanted to ask about the ledger." "I'm still organizing everything." "May I help?" He smiled politely. "I appreciate that. But I'd rather finish alone." Technically reasonable, emotionally defensive. As he lifted one box into his car, a single folded document slipped onto the parking lot without him noticing. I waited until he drove away before walking over. It wasn't the missing ledger page. It was a routing sheet. Across the top appeared one line: Transfer Authorization. Military Widow Legacy Trust. Beneath it rested Eleanor's signature, then Harold's, Then one final blank signature line, unsigned. The agreement remained incomplete. For the first time since opening the church newsletter, I experienced something I had carefully avoided. Not confusion, not grief, fear. Because if that final authorization remained unfinished before the remembrance service, everything Eleanor had quietly built could still fall apart. I folded the unsigned transfer authorization into Eleanor's sewing journal before driving home. The document rested between two pages she had written years apart. One described choosing thread colors, the other described choosing hope. Somehow those pages belonged together. The unsigned line at the bottom of the authorization remained fixed in my thoughts, not because a signature was missing, because someone had deliberately left the promise unfinished. During 28 years managing Air Force property records, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When an important file reached every required approval except one, the missing signature usually belonged to the only person whose decision truly mattered. The next morning, Emily arrived carrying coffee before I had even unlocked the front door. "You didn't sleep." "Neither did you." She quietly placed another folder on the kitchen table. "I found Grandma's correspondence box." Inside rested dozens of thank-you letters from military widows. None mentioned money. None mentioned quilts. Instead, they described meals shared, friendships formed, doctor appointments attended together, Christmas gifts quietly delivered. The Mercy Quilt had never simply funded a ministry. It identified women who no longer had to face grief alone. Near the bottom of the box rested one unopened envelope. Across the front, Eleanor had written, "For Ronald, after you understand stewardship, not after the auction, not after the investigation, after stewardship." I carefully unfolded the letter. "My dear Ron, if you're reading this, then you already know there were never two quilts competing for the same place. One belonged in our family. One belonged wherever loneliness still needed company." I paused. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Then I reached the final paragraph. "Only one person can complete the transfer after I'm gone." I refused to choose for him. He must decide whether love can be shared without being diminished. No name, only one missing person, the unsigned authorization. Everything suddenly aligned. That afternoon I drove back to the church archives. Harold Pierce was already waiting beside the locked records room. "I wondered when you'd come." "I found Eleanor's letter." He quietly nodded. "I expected you would." Without another word, he unlocked the archive. For the first time since the investigation began, every storage cabinet stood open. Donation ledgers, insurance riders, guild agreements, inventory logs. Nothing remained hidden. Harold carefully removed one final archive box. Across the lid, someone had written, "Military Widow Legacy Trust." Inside rested every document Eleanor had spent years preparing. Church approvals, guild resolutions, insurance endorsements, trust agreements, the missing ledger page. Nothing had ever disappeared. Harold had separated the records until the documentary chain could stand on its own. He quietly looked toward the unsigned authorization resting in my hands. "Eleanor asked me one question before she died." "What was it?" "If Ronald discovers everything, will he keep the quilt for himself?" The words settled heavily between us. I told her I didn't know. Harold lowered his eyes. She smiled and said, "Then don't let anyone decide before he does." Technically complete, emotionally devastating, I finally understood why the transfer remained unfinished, not because the church lacked paperwork, not because Harold delayed the files, because Eleanor believed the final act of mercy could never belong to her. It had to become mine. Harold quietly placed a fountain pen beside the authorization. "You can sign today. No one will stop you." I looked at the empty signature line, then gently closed the folder. "Not yet." Harold frowned. "The remembrance service is tomorrow." "I know. If you wait any longer, I won't be choosing freely." For the first time since opening the church newsletter, I willingly appeared defeated. I folded the authorization back into the archive box, then walked away without signing a single page. Harold watched me leave. He believed fear had finally won. He never realized the decision I postponed would become the evidence that changed everything the following morning. The annual remembrance service began beneath soft autumn sunlight, filtering through the stained glass windows of our little church. Every pew was filled. Veterans, military families, church volunteers, widows Eleanor had quietly served for years. Many of them held small pieces of blue ribbon tied around their wrists. I recognized the shade immediately. It matched the hidden golden and blue thread Eleanor stitched into every quilt she believed carried a promise instead of a pattern. Harold Pierce stood near the front, carrying the archive box that had occupied my thoughts for nearly 2 weeks. The unsigned transfer authorization rested inside, exactly where I had left it. Emily quietly joined me before the service began. She slipped one folded note into my hand. "Grandma asked me to give you this only after you walked into church without signing." Without signing, she had expected this. I unfolded the note. Only one sentence appeared. "Mercy offered too quickly can become obligation instead of love." I quietly smiled. Even now, Eleanor was still teaching me patience. The remembrance service opened with prayer. Then names of local veterans who had passed away during the year were read aloud. After the final hymn, Harold stepped to the podium. "We have one unfinished matter before we close." The sanctuary became completely silent. He lifted the archive box onto the table. "For several years our church has protected a charitable project begun by Eleanor Hayes. Not hidden, protected. The difference mattered." Harold looked toward me. "Mr. Hayes, the final decision has always belonged to you." He placed the unsigned authorization on the lectern where every member of the congregation could see it. No pressure, no speeches, only one waiting signature. I slowly walked forward, not toward the document, toward the display quilt hanging beside the altar, the replacement quilt, the memory quilt. Families had admired it for years without realizing its quiet purpose. I gently touched its border, then turned back toward the congregation. My wife never asked me to choose between family and strangers. I paused. She asked whether love becomes smaller after we share it. Silence answered. I picked up the unsigned authorization, then carefully folded it closed again, without signing. Several people looked confused. Harold looked even more surprised. I quietly reached into my jacket pocket and removed Eleanor's sewing journal. The final page remained open. Memory quilt, mercy quilt, side by side. I placed the journal beside the authorization. These documents were never meant to stand separately. Margaret Lawson stepped forward carrying another folder: guild meeting minutes, insurance riders, donation ledgers, widow assistance records, every missing document. Track A quietly became Track B. The complete documentary chain finally lay before the congregation. Nothing depended upon assumptions anymore. Nothing depended upon incomplete records. Every document confirmed the one before it. Harold slowly removed the missing donation ledger page from the archive box, then placed it beside the others. I believed protecting the records protected Eleanor's work. He lowered his eyes. I was wrong. It only delayed people from understanding it. Technically true, emotionally complete, Emily then quietly approached the front, carrying one final object wrapped inside white cotton cloth. She unfolded it with extraordinary care, the original Mercy quilt. The entire sanctuary fell silent. No one applauded, no one whispered. Many simply cried, not because they were looking at valuable fabric, because they finally understood they were looking at years of unseen kindness stitched together one careful act at a time. Only then did I pick up the fountain pen. The signature no longer felt like surrender. It felt like stewardship. I signed the authorization, not because I was giving Eleanor's quilt away, because I finally understood she had never intended anyone to own Mercy, only to continue it. The congregation quietly rose to its feet. Not for me, for the promise Eleanor had spent her final years preparing. And for the first time since opening that church newsletter, I realized the original quilt had never truly been missing. It had simply been waiting until everyone could finally understand what it was meant to become. The remembrance service ended without applause. People simply remained where they were. Some quietly embraced. Others stood beside the Mercy quilt for several long moments before leaving the sanctuary. No one seemed eager to be the first person to walk away from something Eleanor had spent years preparing. Emily and I waited until the church had almost emptied before returning to the fellowship hall. The archive box still rested on the long oak table. Only now every document inside had been properly signed, catalogued, and placed in chronological order. The donation ledgers, the insurance appraisals, the quilting guild agreements, the widow ministry records, Eleanor's sewing journals. For the first time since opening the church newsletter weeks earlier, the entire documentary chain told one uninterrupted story. Nothing remained hidden. Nothing remained unfinished. Harold Pierce quietly approached carrying one final cedar box I had never seen before. I believe this belongs to your family, not the church, your family. He placed it gently into my hands. Inside rested a folded piece of blue fabric wrapped around one handwritten letter. The fabric immediately caught my attention. It carried Eleanor's hidden golden finishing thread, not enough to make a quilt, only enough to finish one. Emily unfolded the letter while I held the cloth. My dear Ron and Emily, if this box has finally reached you, then the Mercy quilt has found its home, and the memory quilt has remembered its own. That means neither one failed its purpose. Emily paused while quietly wiping away tears. She continued reading. People often believe love must choose between family and strangers. I never believed that. One quilt carried our family's memories. The other carried those memories into lives that needed hope. Neither replaced the other. Together they completed each other. I looked down at the small strip of blue fabric resting across my hands. The final paragraph explained everything. I saved these last unfinished threads because every generation deserves the chance to add one stitch of mercy that belongs entirely to them. Please don't frame them. Please don't lock them away. Finish something kind with them. For several moments, neither Emily nor I spoke. Then she quietly smiled. I know exactly what Grandma meant. So do I. Several months later, the church dedicated a small room beside the quilting workshop. Not a museum, not a memorial. A working studio. Military widows gathered there every Wednesday afternoon. Some learned to sew for the first time. Others simply came for coffee, conversation, and companionship. The original Mercy quilt remained displayed inside a protective case whenever it was not traveling to support the Legacy Trust. The memory quilt stayed with our family, not because it was more valuable, because it reminded us where every act of mercy had first been stitched together. Emily used Eleanor's final golden thread to complete a new quilt square bearing only one embroidered phrase, "Wrapped in Mercy." That square became the first block in a community quilt every widow could help finish. No single family owned it. No single church claimed it. It simply continued growing, one careful stitch at a time. If this story reminded you that the greatest heirlooms are not the treasures we keep, but the compassion we choose to continue, thank you for sharing this journey. May your home always preserve beautiful memories, your hands always find meaningful work, and your kindness become the thread that quietly warms someone else's life long after you're gone.